Tharoor of India. He's a celebrated author with more than 15 bestseller books. He was also formerly an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and ran for the post of Secretary General in 2006. As a cherry on top, we know Dr. Tharoor for his impressive vocabulary, for his great sense of humor, and his empowering speeches, especially for us young people. On behalf of the ICO and UNCCD, I would like to invite Dr. Tharoor to our brown bag lunch, where we will discuss the future of multilateralism. Before we start, I would like to walk our audience through the agenda. For our first segment, we will hear from Dr. Tharoor on the future of multilateralism, on surrounding issues, after which we will open the floor for questions. So questions from our audience here and from our online audience. As a code of conduct, I would request our attendees to please make their questions specific to the subject matter and the topic being discussed today. Thank you. After the Q&A, we will head to the closing session, and finally, the in-person attendees will head towards the brown bag lunches outside. Now, without any further ado, let's start the segment with Dr. Tharoor.
Pleasure.
Dr. Tharoor, I would like to start off by briefly brushing on the role of UN, governments, private sector, and youths in multilateralism. In 2020, amidst the pandemic, you had quoted that we must re-intervene, reaffirm multilateralism for a better world. Now, how can we transform the future of multilateralism, especially in the fast-paced world?
Right. Well, first of all, good to see you all. I spent 29 years in the UN system, and I've been out of it for 15. So it's really back to the future, the past. I'm not sure, but back anyway. Good to see you all. On your question, I would say that, frankly, if we were to be very, very honest with each other as friends and at least colleagues at one time, it is to say that multilateralism has never been in worse shape. We are looking at a situation in which both COVID and the Ukraine crisis have exposed grievous fault lines in everything we had assumed was happening in the world at the end of the Cold War. Many of us at the UN in those days allowed ourselves to believe in the sort of heady idea that now we were really entering a golden period for multilateralism. There was no longer Cold War to worry about, that the world would converge on common norms. You remember responsibility to protect was adopted at that time. There was a sense that sovereignties would no longer be an obstacle to the world coming together and thinking in terms of their common humanity. And yet something like COVID, which is, of course, itself proof that we are all linked as human beings by this common menace of a global pandemic, this absolute concrete proof of our common humanity, revealed what? It revealed, if anything, that countries suddenly woke up to their self-interest first and above all, that all the countries that talked about cooperating with each other, that issued bromides for decades, at that moment, under the pressure of something that could be a matter of life and death, started sealing their borders, started trying to collect all the equipment, PPE and surgical gloves. And at that point, there were no vaccines, but medicines, everything they could collect for themselves. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. Rich countries, poor countries, everybody said sovereignty, self-protection. People can only rely on their own governments to look after themselves. I mean, the European Union had been preaching to us for decades. And what did they do? First thing after the virus started, end of the Schengen Agreement. They put up borders between the Schengen countries. They've been talking solidarity with each other. Well, the first European member country to have a COVID case was Italy. Instead of showing solidarity to their fellow EU member, they sealed their borders with Italy, denied Italy any relief and assistance, didn't send them any experts, any helpers, nothing. It was every man for himself, every country for itself. And that was sobering enough. It got worse when the vaccines were finally found, because all the countries started trying to corner vaccines for themselves. I'm proud that my country was a bit of an exception, but only a bit, because we also took care of our own population first, even while we managed to export some for elsewhere. But one of the most tragic and shame-making pieces of news in the last couple of months has been the number of vaccines that are going to be thrown away because they have expired by countries that have accumulated during the crisis far more than they needed for their own people. The British, I think, have had purchased enough vaccines for 3 times their population, some other countries for 5 times their population. And there are literally millions of doses that could have actually shortened the pandemic if they'd been sent to African countries, the Caribbean countries, and so on. They didn't have any, but which were hoarded by the rich countries that are now going to be jettisoned and thrown away because they'll no longer be valid. So what does this tell us about multilateralism, international cooperation? That it's fine in good times, you can talk about it when everything is fine, but the moment you have a real crisis, it's every country for itself. Ukraine war, what happened to all the pious things about the sovereignty of states, inviolability of borders, inadmissibility of the use of force to settle disputes? Overnight, forgotten. A permanent member of the Security Council violating the sovereignty of an ordinary member. So you're suddenly seeing that all the assumptions that we, even at the beginning of this century, were complacent about, the moment they came under stress, they disappeared. They had no force, no value. So somebody who spent 29 years preaching the virtues of multilateralism, spoke around the world, believed in it myself, I've been shaken to the core. And I, as somebody who believed profoundly in the UN system, kept asking myself, when for 7 weeks the Brits and the French and the Americans were screaming from the rooftops that Russia was about to invade, where was the Secretary General? Why wasn't he on a plane to Moscow and Kyiv? Why was there no special envoy sent to find out what were Moscow's minimum irreducible demands? How serious was the danger? Were they going to be tempted to act? What was the price that you had to pay to get them not to act? Whatever. I mean, when in 1998, when I was in Kofi Annan's office and the US president of the time, Mr. Clinton, threatened to bomb Baghdad, he got on a plane the next day and flew to Iraq and met Saddam Hussein and averted the danger of a permanent member bombing a member state. It only lasted 6 to 9 months before Saddam again managed to get on the wrong side of those guys, and the war inevitably became unpreventable. But nonetheless, at least the Secretary General tried. I went with him, so I can tell you, he made an effort because he felt there was a certain role that came with his office. Was it because he was doing this at a moment, the so-called unipolar moment, when there weren't constraints on a Secretary General? Or was it simply because he took an initiative that another Secretary General was unprepared to take? Your guess is as good as mine. All I know is something was attempted once, it wasn't attempted this time. So I really worry. I mean, you're all working for the UN. I did it with pride for nearly 3 decades. What is that worth? What does it stand for? When you have a pandemic like this, are you going to now have a situation again the next time where WHO tries to send experts to China and China refuses them visas and China does its own thing, and then the rest of the world says, oh my gosh, how horrible to realize that we're dependent on China for active pharmaceutical ingredients. Let's try and hasten to get production lines back home or nearer home. I mean, you had example after example which suddenly revealed that perhaps the UN system is both too weak and too politicized, that each UN agency is too dependent on the more powerful of its members to get things done, where each agency doesn't have the independence of action for its executive head to take initiatives that will incur the wrath of its more powerful member states. All of these things suddenly made us wonder, I mean, why couldn't the world have come together, identified the pandemic as soon as it happened, acted in the common interest, identified best practices, responded, learned common lessons? Where has all that happened? In fact, as you know, President Trump tried to pull out of WHO in the course of the pandemic. So tell me what the future of multilateralism is. And I have to say, it looks very bleak if we look at the last 5 years of our human experience. But my answer is, of course, that we can't do without it, because clearly the world is better when we work together. The hope for humanity has to lie in international cooperation, in that notion of the common humanity that I talked about. And if we can't build new, if you, the younger generation, are going to inherit the world that the rest of us have left in such a mess, you have to face these realities and ensure that the next time something like this happens, there's a different response. And you have to be a generation of leaders that believes in thinking beyond yourselves, beyond your national borders, beyond your immediate preoccupations, and thinking in terms of that larger common humanity.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. That was super interesting perspective. Now, in light of countries cooperating, in today's world, data sharing is everything. But data sharing is everything. And in 2019, in the parliament, you had raised the issue of data leakages and surveillance. You highlighted the importance of having robust data protection framework. But our data is already crossing boundaries. How can multilateralism be used as a tool to address this issue or this crisis and protect us?
Well, right now it isn't being used. And in fact, countries or at best sub-regions are coming up with their own data protection guidelines. The EU's GDPR, for example, is very different from the laws that prevail in the US and the law that's being debated now in India. We are looking at different countries drawing up their own rules, and the Chinese, of course, have essentially subtracted themselves from the exercise by creating their own world around them, their own internet, their own Google, their own e-commerce sites, and eventually their own artificial intelligence. We're already reading about how Chinese artificial intelligence will tout the virtues of Marxism-Leninism, will not be allowed to use the words Tiananmen Square, and so on and so forth. So suddenly you're finding, if anything, that the world is again anything but multilateral. I'd like to see a multilateral agreement on data protection. I think it would be very healthy if there were global standards to ensure that, perhaps learning from the experiences of those who have gone ahead so far, but trying to improve on the lessons learned from the application of those, that we create a global convention on data protection that applies to all. All countries sign up to it, everyone obligatorily mandates it, number one. That creates, amongst other things, standards that address such thorny issues as data sovereignty, because after all, the UN is a body of sovereign states, and therefore the rights of sovereign states are going to matter. Data sovereignty becomes an issue. The protection of data, personal data relating to individuals in their own, having to be in their own countries. Right now, for example, I think many countries, the international credit card companies will have to maintain servers in the countries where people use their credit cards so that their personal data is available in their home countries. Now, you can see this kind of thing getting completely fragmented unless you have an international convention that makes it work. I would even go beyond this to say, why not an internationally sanctioned a higher court, a kind of tribunal to resolve disputes and appeals? Just as we have an international court of justice, can we have an international court on data protection? Except it can't just be one where sovereign governments can be clients, which is the case now with the ICJ. It's got to be one where individuals who feel they didn't get the right decision from their own home government, that they can appeal to a larger body that says the standards established in the convention were upheld or not. If we can create, as we have done, an international criminal court that can try even former presidents and prime ministers for crimes against their own people, why can't we think of an international data protection authority? I'd like us to think big and think imaginatively, but it's not happening so far. And in the climate of multilateralism that I've described to you, it may be a bit of a stretch, but I do believe it needs to be done.
Thank you so much. Now, in the spirit of learning, you took a special interest in problems and challenges of education, distance education, and international legislation for education. In the post-COVID world that we've talked about so much, we can learn and teach from anywhere around the world. How can multilateralism support in internationalization of education?
Actually, on this one, I'm not so sure I'm going to be singing the evangelical line on multilateralism, because I actually think COVID taught many, many parents that all the hype about long-distance education, video conferences, and MOOCs and so on were grossly overblown. I have a niece with a 10-year-old daughter. I have many friends with young children. They say it was a nightmare period for them. You cannot expect children to stay riveted on a screen for the hours that they normally would listen to teachers at school. You cannot expect children individually atomized in lockdown in their homes to learn from what you're getting from a distance, without interacting, without having breaks, without playing with friends, etc. Distractions were multiple at home when this was done. There's also the further complication when you talk about international education. There is the complication of comprehensibility. The language used by an American or a British scholar may not be understood by a schoolroom in Kenya or in India, even though it's the same language, it's still English. But we may not understand it the same way, the vocabulary, the assumptions, the cultural assumptions embedded in the phrases. How are you going to get this kind of thing done unless you actually use this kind of course only to complement or to supplement what a classroom teacher is teaching in the classroom? I don't believe it's going to work. I have full sympathy for those kids who took a gap year rather than accept admission to a campus where all the courses were online. They wanted the campus experience, and I genuinely believe that you learn as much from your classmates, from interactions with them, from being out in the cafe, for attending informal talks like this one, from questioning your teachers outside the classroom as well. Formal learning is all that online instruction can do. It also makes it a mass experience. It doesn't give you the individual attention a teacher can give in the classroom. I know from the simple business of having suddenly been dragged into a number of online things. I do make talks around my country and even around the world. And I suddenly did 4 times as many online during COVID. And I initially thought, hey, what a relief. I could never have accepted a speech in Bangalore and in Calcutta on the same day. But today I can, because I'm just doing it online. I'm sitting at home, great. But believe me, after a while, it palled. And when you as a speaker realize you can't look into the eyes of the people you're speaking to, you can't see if they're absorbing anything, if they're looking at their watch, they're beginning to shake it to wonder how long this is going to go on. If you can't do that, if you can't relate, you can't take questions directly from people you can actually see, you lose out as much as a speaker, as much as the audience loses out in the audience. And the charm of that began to fade. And I had friends who refused to do online things within about 6 months of the pandemic. I went on for over a year before I also said enough is enough. This is just not worth it. The amount of energy and voice you're expending is just the same. You're saving yourself a plane trip, but you're not getting 1/10 of the satisfaction you get from really interacting with real people. So that's also true education. And I have to say, yes, there's lots of merits to be said, and let's create an international convention, global courses and universal subjects in the sciences and mathematics, and have them available for developing countries free, etc. Maybe, I mean, you can do all of this. I'm surprised UNESCO hasn't even been spurred to do it, because there's been so much of private sector boosting for international education. But at the end of the day, for God's sake, be aware of the limitations. Understand human beings and human nature and the need to interact with each other. Understand that humanity requires a certain amount of connection with each other, and also this whole business of comprehension. Create international education portals and courses and so on if you wish, but make them into teachers' aids to help teachers in their local environments do a better job, not as an alternative to. If you do an alternative to, you're going to end up with a very, very mal-educated generation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. I also finished my master's degree during pandemic, and I can definitely say that my attention span is getting shorter. Mm-hmm. There was too much information overload. And in that light, we live in an age of misinformation and disinformation as well. Mm-hmm. So much so that WHO during the pandemic coined a new word called infodemic. Mm-hmm. As a generation that largely now mistrusts authority, how can multilateralism help in addressing this particular issue?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big, lively controversy going on in India right now, this whole business about fake news. And you all remember when people in America were talking about a post-truth world. As far as I'm concerned, post-truth is a fancy way of saying lies, right? I mean, that's all it really boils down to. Now, I agree with the idea that there may not be absolute truths in some areas, that there could be your view and my view of history, of facts, of an incident that many of you have seen, the classic film Rashomon, which shows how the same incident can be viewed from different perspectives by different people. I was inspired by that to write a novel called Riot, about a riot in India, in 13 different voices of 13 different characters who saw bits of what happened and their own understanding and their own perspective of it. So I accept that, truth can sometimes be modified with a possessive pronoun. But nonetheless, there are some things that, that old joke that says you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That remains classically true. Facts are facts. You can choose what to make of those facts. But, where something happened, it happened. And then you're going to say what you want to do about it. That's fine. Now, the problem is who gets to adjudicate. And I think one of the things that I've often told myself is how wonderful it would be if there were a truly credible global fact-checking agency with no axe to grind for any particular government or any particular point of view. And imagine if the UN were to set this up. I don't know which body, but I guess UNESCO would probably be the body to do that. Set up a global fact-checking agency staffed by people from every culture, every language, every country, and all they would do is spend all day researching what really happened on any story that any citizen of the world could send them. Initially, they may get swamped. Maybe they'll develop systems maybe AI will come and help them process some of the requests coming in. But imagine that, because right now, what we're seeing in the part of many governments is they're wanting to control and check even fact-checking. So in India right now, there's a court case going on because the government wanted to set up a fact-checking unit in its Press Information Bureau. And they said they would only use it for fake news about government programs. But how do you know that a critic of a government program will not be accused of having said fake news when actually his criticism is well-founded? Unless the government stays out of this business and you have independent, neutral, objective bodies, but who decides who's objective or not? Some of the best well-known independent fact-checkers in India are already being attacked by the ruling party as being biased in favor of the opposition and so on. So the best one is to have something completely out and above, beyond all the legal systems of all the countries and all their politics. Just purely independent, academic, well-trained professionals who all they do is check facts. Maybe a very boring career. Maybe they'll all burn out after 2 or 3 years. And maybe it won't. Who knows? Maybe it'll be the most exciting thing they've ever done. But that, to my mind, would be a phenomenal invention. And there I go back to being an enthusiastic multilateralist. That's something that only a UN body or something that is above and beyond every single government on earth could truly be neutral and independent.
Thank you so much. Now, this last question of mine is a bit too personal for me. This room is filled with ambitious young soul. We young people, especially the ones that live outside their country, have this zeal to go back home and to perhaps create jobs back home, to perhaps address some issues, to address or improve the livelihoods of people. You have a career trajectory that aspires me and many young people. I want to ask you for your advice. What worked for you, and also what did not work for you? What would you advise us young people today?
Yeah, it's, first of all, let me assure all of you, you never really stop thinking you're young, right? Inside every old gray-haired geezer, there's a young person struggling to get out. So it's still there, all of us. So, yeah, I mean, I joined the UN at 22, which is probably younger than most of you here managed to do. And I did so with a lot of idealism, a lot of commitment, started working for refugees, went on to peacekeeping, and then the Secretary General's office. So I had a wonderful, I was very, very lucky with my career. There was no paper pushing, file pushing kind of work. I was always action and doing and getting things done. And I was also fortunate to be recognized throughout the system and rise in ways that many career people don't get a chance to rise, going from P2 to Under Secretary General in a matter of, what was it, about 23, 24 years. So it was for me, an experience that I would never trade for anything. It was fabulous. And yet, when the moment came that I felt I couldn't continue, my instinct was indeed to go back home. All of us, we tell ourselves the world is our oyster. We're comfortable anywhere on the planet. We want to make a difference to the whole world. But at bottom, there's some place where you feel an affinity, where you feel you belong, and where you feel you want to make a contribution that you can't do from a global platform. And so that's certainly if that's not true of some of you, it's true of most of you, I'm sure. And it certainly was true for me. So I went back. It wasn't easy because I went into politics, and the transition from a UN international servant's life to a political life was not easy. And I went through quite a few tortures and torments in the process. But at the end of it all, what kept me going was the feeling that whatever I was doing was making a difference to my own country, my own people. And though all of us can claim at some senses to be citizens of the world, we also have another core citizenship behind that, which has to matter and which does matter to most of us. So I've forgotten what the thrust of your question was. I got distracted by the young people thing.
So what worked for you and what did not work for you? I think
when I went back.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think what worked for me was that I'd seen the world, I'd had a good sense of what happens, and I was uniquely privileged in my UN career, and that I'd done humanitarian work, I'd done political work, I'd done peacekeeping and therefore military work, I'd done administration and budget because I ran my own department, I'd done the high-level geopolitics, being in the Secretary General's office, one of his right fingers, not his right hand, but one of his right fingers, and traveling with him to meet heads of state and government. So I suddenly felt that I had enough exposure to speak with some authority on matters that came my way in the UN system. I mean, in national politics, because I knew what the rest of the world dealt with, how the rest of the world dealt with these things and what the challenges were. What didn't work, I think, was that it took a little while to make the full adjustment to different ways of thinking, to the different nature of our culture, of our politics, of our discourse. One of the things, the UN used to wheel me out all the time on world media. So I was the only guy who was, out there to not only do every single sort of CNN show and BBC show, but also the rabid critics we had in America, like Fox News and Geraldo Rivera and so on. There I was defending the UN in those places. So I had the naive impression that I was good at that. And then I came to India, and in politics, I very quickly discovered the wisdom of Shakespeare's adage that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. In politics, it doesn't matter what you thought you said and what you meant to say. All that matters is what people believe they heard, or what they're made to believe that they heard. And your political enemies will be out there distorting everything you say and making a fool out of you. And that happened to me once too often in my early years in politics. So things like that, vocabulary, working in even though the UN is an organization with 6 languages, it really has only 2 working languages. And as long as you're reasonably accurate and fluent in those 2, you can be pretty sure you're measuring your words okay. And it's very rare to be misquoted or misunderstood at the global level. But in national politics, a country like India, where we have 23 languages that are official, and where we have everything that can be translated and mistranslated to make you look like a chump, it's a different world. And so there was a lot of adjustment I had to make. Not to mention, I didn't go into the upper house where many former UN officials in their countries get appointed to office. I actually went out and got votes from a constituency and had to win those votes again, as I've done 3 times now. And I'm contemplating a 4th election in the next 9 months. It's a very different challenge from anything we do in our UN offices.
I think I'm surely taking notes. Right. So now we head on to a question and answer segment where we take questions from you. So for our attendees here, please raise your hands for your questions. And
he plays traffic cop, so don't look at me.
Yes,
catch her eye.
I will catch my eye. Right. So here, you can just press on your mic and.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, tell me who you are, which country you're from, and so it's always good to know that.
Yeah, so my name is Gaurang Thanekar. I'm living in Germany since last 7 years, but I'm from India, Mumbai. Yeah, so my question would be, as we see currently...
Which agency do you work for?
Which
agency do you work for?
No, I'm still studying.
Oh, you're still studying?
Yeah,
okay, great.
Master in Digital Health. So my question is that currently you see that even in Europe or India, in all across globe, governments are turning rightwards than the left, and that extreme to right, that side of political orientation of a country might be a threatening towards multilateralism. And what's your take on that political orientation and diplomatic relation between 2 different countries, how that will roll out for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that what you said is accurate, because we've seen it happen. It's partially a backlash to globalization. And it took two kinds of backlash. There was an economic backlash, which particularly took place in the developed world, where people saw their jobs being shanghaied, as it were. Why are our governments supporting policies that take our jobs away and give them to people in China or India or whatever? And that became a very potent source of backlash in many countries. And the other was a cultural backlash, which was about resentment of these global cosmopolitans, Davos men, as the expression went, who were all sort of, comfortable with each other, but didn't care for the working class in their own countries, who were suddenly invaded by foreigners, immigrants, people from other countries speaking other languages on their streets. And the combination of this cultural and economic backlash is what gave you the enormous phenomena of the previous decade of the century, where you had Donald Trump coming up in America with Make America Great Again. You have Brexit happening because people didn't like hearing all these East European languages on the streets of England, where you have the rise of various forms of these nativist movements in European democracies, Alternative for Deutschland, the Freedom Party in Austria, the Party for Freedom in Netherlands, Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen in France, and so on. And though they didn't actually win elections anyway, they all came very close. Many of them came second in order to actually change the discourse in their countries. So you suddenly see all of these things happening. And you see it beyond Western Europe as well. So you've got Erdogan in Turkey, you've got Orban in Hungary, you've got Narendra Modi in India, people who are essentially saying, these ruthless cosmopolitans have no right to lead you and speak for you. We are more authentic. We are rooted in our country's culture, in our country's religion, in our country's way of doing things. We will tell you what's the right thing to do. And there's only one right thing, and that's through us. So suddenly you get a certain amount of nationalist strongman kind of politics taking place. And that, again, is very striking in many, many countries. Where does all this lead, and what impact will it have on multilateralism? Obviously, since Mr. Putin himself belongs to this brigade, I mean, he too can be sort of anointed the honorary chairman of the Nationalist International, because that's what you're seeing. All these countries who believe that their country is all that matters. And it stands, I mean, democracy is the same thing. People are interested in their voters. Authoritarian states, the same thing. They're interested in the country that they're ruling. And in these circumstances, there are undoubtedly threats to multilateralism, no doubt about it. So when I talked about some of the phenomena that worries me, I could have added this too, as one more thing that the world, I hope, will outgrow and resist and come back from. When we accept that we are better when we are together and we're cooperating with each other, only then will we be in a position to ensure that we can look beyond these immediate interests. Now, I don't want to be too sort of simplistic in the analysis, because there's some countries which are like this domestically, but are quite willing to be international minded. India is one of them. We have an Indian government which domestically is much more sort of, about this rootedness, but internationally wants cooperation and wants to be multilateralist and everything from peacekeeping to COVID cooperation and so on. And there are other countries where perhaps democratically they are diverse in their domestic policies, but when it came to nationalism during COVID and so on, they read it around themselves. There's this very interesting book by a British journalist called David Goodhart, who says the world is really divided into two kinds of people: the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres are people like us who are comfortable in any country, speak many languages, can stay in five-star hotels and business class lounges around the world. And the somewheres are people who are rooted in one place, one language, one culture, one community. And he argues that that's the battle that really matters in the world today. I'm not sure I fully buy it, but it's interesting. When his book came out, it was about the time that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, said, anyone who considers himself a citizen of the world hasn't understood the first thing of what citizenship is all about, quote unquote. So the idea is you are a citizen of your country. Don't you ever forget that. And your loyalty has to be first to your own country. That kind of belief is widespread. And so multilateralism is in the process of being redefined under these pressures.
Right. I would like to go to the second row now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Tharoor, you've painted a very vivid picture of what multilateralism.
Tell me where you're from and what your name is.
Sorry. My name is Gilles Amadou Ouedraogo. I'm from Burkina Faso in the Sahel. And I work for UNCCD also. You said something very important. So multilateralism is valuable as long as, well, I'm going to that point. It's about all of us sharing something together and all of us getting something out of it. But what happens when you're sharing and you're not getting something out of it? So currently we're going through a period in the Sahel where we've had 6 coups in the last 5 years only. And if you look at the root causes of these coups, it's really because we are rebelling against our former colonizers, and we no longer want to feel exploited, and we want to feel like we are in charge of our own decisions. So in a world where you had Donald Trump, we saw what happened during COVID. You have all of these different changes in the way that protectionism is rampant. Nationalism is also rampant. And we also see that we need to protect our own interests. Theresa May, the example that you gave is a perfect one, is first you have to be a citizen of your own country, protect your own interests before you look outward. So what advice would you give to Sahelian leaders right now who are trying to make that happen for themselves and stand up for what is right for themselves and for their countries?
Well, no, you slightly misunderstood my point. I'm saying this is what people have been doing, but I'm saying it may not entirely be good for the world that that's the way they're doing it. That, for example, in something like a global pandemic, each country for itself is precisely the wrong thing to do. Yes, as a national leader, you are accountable to your own people, and therefore you must do what's necessary. But unless you do simultaneously what's good for the rest of the world, you can never keep your own people safe. The pandemic is the classic proof of that, right? And every country that thought they could act on their own and wall off their people inevitably discovered they were wrong. Even China. China, within 3 months, had created the most stringent lockdown on earth. I've talked to people who were living in China at the time. It was insane. They would come and board up the windows in your room so no air could get out, kind of thing. It was that kind of. It was an amazingly stringent lockdown, and suddenly, at least according to the official Chinese media, there were no cases of COVID after 3 months after the thing. 2 years later, when they went back to normal, and the world went back to normal, guess which country got the most COVID cases? It was China, because inevitably they didn't have the protection since they hadn't exposed themselves as other countries had to what was going on. So ultimately, this is the classic truism that until everyone is safe, no one is safe. And that, I mean, the pandemic happens to be a very good example of that, but the same thing could happen in other cases too. There are areas in which you must have international cooperation. Climate change is another one. You can't fence off the sky. You can't control your own climate, the air you breathe, everything else. So there's no point saying, I've met my national targets, screw you, because the rest of the world is going to say, fine, we haven't, and we're going to pollute the air and it's going to blow into your country soon. So let's understand the huge importance of identifying those issues in which the only effective solution is global or international, since at the moment we are a collection of national sovereignties, and try and maximize our cooperation on those. And organizations like WHO really ought to be the testing ground for taking multilateralism as far as it can be taken, because that's one area where national sovereignty should be much less relevant than almost anything else.
Let's take a question from behind. Yes, please. The blue shirt behind.
Okay, thank you. My name is Vikrant Barbe.
Okay, we're having a bit of a gender problem here. I think some ladies' hands are not being noticed by our lady master of ceremonies.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. But do find a couple of ladies after. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Vikrant Barbe. I work with the Climate Change Secretariat and an Indian citizen staying in Germany, also served in Africa for the Climate Change Secretariat. My question to you, Mr. Tharoor, is how do you see the global multilateralism against the regional blocs based on economics, based on some common interests? Like we have many, starting from G7, G20, Quad, European Union, African Union, SARC, and all sort of that, to name a few actually. So how do you see whether these regional groups based on regional parts or economic parts help support the global multilateralism, or do you think it differently?
I did, when I was at the UN, I was a big fan of regional and sub-regional organizations because I thought they helped enhance international cooperation under the rubric of the global system. Today, I'm a little less sure because sometimes countries are turning to regional organizations as an alternative to cooperating on the global stage. And the risk of sounding political, I mean, China is a very good example. And now China and Russia are trying busily to strengthen organizations in their regions of which they're a part, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the East Asian Economic Community, at the expense of cooperating with global institutions. BRICS, for example, seemed a good idea when it started. But increasingly, it seems that what Beijing wants to do with BRICS is to make it an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions, which are global. And if China has its way, there'll soon be a few more members coming in. They'll all be paying their share to the BRICS Development Bank, and the BRICS Development Bank will soon be better capitalized than the World Bank. So you suddenly find regional and sub-regional organizations that become alternatives to the global institutions. And I'm not saying the global institutions are perfect. I think it's outrageous that, for as long as they did, these institutions, which reflected a certain Western dominance that was totally appropriate in 1945, continue to do so 60, 70 years later, when they weren't so appropriate. And when countries that had acquired independence since then, African countries, for example, couldn't see any increase in their clout in these bodies, even though they had changed dramatically since the economic realities of 1945. So the failure of these global institutions to prove more adaptable is also partly to blame. So I'm not just saying that the countries that created the BRICS Development Bank are villains on this. I'm just understanding what happened was there was resistance to change. It came about rather slowly. It was in Pittsburgh in 2008 that the G7 agreed to transfer some voting power in the Bretton Woods institutions to emerging markets away from the rich developed countries. But the progress has been fitful. And other countries are saying, why don't we take our marbles and play in another field? And that when kids do that, it's bad enough. When states do that, it's really worrying.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. We have to take a couple of questions from online, and then we'll come back to you and our ladies for the questions here. But I now would like to request my colleague Joanne to please ask the questions from the chat box.
Yes, so we had many questions online, and so it's very hard to choose. But the first question is from Minister Reina Sotillo from Argentina. How do you see the renewal of cooperation mechanisms through multilateralism, especially South-South cooperation? How could it be promoted from multilateralism, in particular in the face of problem on land degradation and drought?
Well, it's happening. I mean, I would say South-South cooperation has been a growth industry for the last 15, 20 years. You're seeing not only examples of multilateral bodies, but new ones coming up. I mean, I mentioned BRICS, but look at IBSA, which is India, Brazil, South Africa, and their cooperation. And look at the increasing connections between Latin American countries and Asian countries, which historically had very little to do with each other because of differences of geography, of language, of distance, all of that. Now suddenly there's more connection. India has used its G20 presidency to become a voice of the global South, and there are southern countries from every continent in the G20, and they're talking to each other. So I'm not worried about multilateral cooperation among southern countries, but can the South do it on its own? Does it not need the North as well? I'm increasingly convinced that while South-South cooperation is important and valuable, that to do it without the North has two almost paradoxical problems. The first is I'm not sure we can do everything without the North being involved, supportive, and giving us resources and technology. But on the other hand, if we just focus on South-South cooperation, we give the North a free pass. So that's the paradox. Why should the North, which has grown very often, I'm sorry, over 200 years at the expense of the South, why should they be be told, okay, the South is going to cooperate with each other, you guys buzz off? And the people in the North say, fine, we don't have any worry about our responsibilities to the development of the rest of the world. So I'm all in favor of South-South cooperation, provided it's linked also to a certain amount of involvement, support, technology, and so on from the North.
Joanne, one more question, please.
Second question is the UN system adequately oriented to enable civil society to make an effective contribution to multilateralism? In UNCCD, for instance, do you think that the stakeholder engagement mechanism is effective?
Yeah, I mean, civil society, I was at the UN when we really made a serious effort to get civil society involved. We created forums, and in fact, to this day, there are two major bodies in New York. There's the ECOSOC NGO, a grouping which allows civil society organizations a voice, and there's also the DPI, the Department of Public Information's annual gathering of NGOs and civil society organizations. The problem is it hasn't gone beyond that. So it's civil society organizations talking to each other, which can be useful, and they can give each other lots of information, advice, networking, all of these good things. But what you need ideally is civil society organizations being able to influence governments through an international body that multiplies their influence more than they can do by direct national participation. So a civil society organization that, for example, their own home government isn't listening to, can they find a forum through the UN that enables them to bring pressure on their and other governments on behalf of a cause that other civil society bodies from other countries can support? That kind of thing would be fascinating if it can be pulled off. But so far, we haven't been able to get there, and I don't see a mechanism ready to do that. I remember at one point when Davos was at its peak, there was this alternative Davos that was being created by a number of southern countries to try and which did involve civil society groups and organizations, trying to say that, look, Davos is for the fat cats, the businesses, the top governments. We are for the people and civil society around the world, and we will articulate a different view. But of course, it turned out to be unsustainable beyond a point. You came up with ideas, the novelty got you some media attention, but what could you actually change? And the reality in a world of sovereign nations and governments is that you need governments to bring about change. You need to be able to influence governments if you want to change anything in the real world, in your countries, through laws, through policies, get the resources for the changes you want, and so on. And I don't think they've cracked that particular conundrum yet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you for our online audience for the great questions. I see that our online Zoom is really buzzing, and we might have to come back to our Zoom for a couple of more questions, but let's go back to our floor and our ladies here. So,
good morning, Dr. Tharoor. This is Nirosha. I'm chartered engineer and a technocrat working for Government of India in Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, Trichy. And my question is,
you're working for the government of India?
Yeah.
What are you doing here in Bonn?
Like I'm on holiday to meet my husband.
Oh, good for you.
Thank you. My question is, you were chairman for standing committee, information technology, right? So like till we are yet to develop our own artificial intelligence regulations law. Last March, I suppose, European Union has developed a very good comprehensive artificial intelligence act, which like regulation act, so and so and so. How do you think that, your opinion, what are all the aspects that we can inherit from this comprehensive AI law, which were devised by European democracies, that we can adapt to Indian ecosystem? Like I want a comprehensive AI law for our government. How come this multilateralism angle can help us?
Well, I would rather see AI be regulated globally, frankly. I mean, I think what the Chinese are up to with their own AI is going to be disastrous if every country started doing that. It would be a recipe for a distorted view of the world, depending on the, I mean, you can well imagine that if a Chinese person goes out of China, what they're going to hear about things that they were so different from what they would see from the same sort of, Chinese equivalent of ChatGPT in China would give them a totally different answer about certain things than they would get elsewhere. That I think on balance is not good for the world. It's not good for human beings, for intellect, for international cooperation, for the work. So I would rather see countries like India saying, yeah, we're working on AI regulations. Some of you have already issued AI regulations. Some of you are also working. Why don't we pool our resources and come up with a global standard for regulating AI? And yes, some countries like China will opt out. They won't agree to sign. Maybe China, Russia, a couple of others. But I would imagine it is possible to think of a regulation for AI which will attract and maintain perhaps 90%, maybe more of the countries in the world. Remember, the other problem with AI is unless your country is big enough like China and maybe like India to subtract itself from a global system and throw up sort of walls around itself, that in any case, even if you try and have a national law in Trinidad and Tobago or in Andorra or in Liechtenstein, at the end of the day, you're going to find yourself submerged by the AI emerging from bigger countries, which your people will have access to anyway. So my answer would be that this would be an interesting challenge for the UN to take up, is to come up with global standards. I mentioned data protection. I would mention the same for AI. And in any case, because this is an invention that clearly will know no borders, with the possible exception of a Chinese great firewall of the internet. My feeling is that it could benefit from global inputs and global cooperation. Now, it's also possible that having created a global standard, each country would be free to apply it in its own country with some relevant modifications, paying attention to its own national culture. That would not necessarily be problematic. A very simple thing is, for example, there are some subjects which in many socially conservative countries would be taboo that are perfectly normal in certain Western advanced societies. And to not accept that there are those differences is also short-sighted. Just as, what is appropriate dress on a beach in Western Europe may not be appropriate dress on a beach in India or Saudi Arabia. So similarly, the same logic could apply in certain ways. But the broad case for global standards of internet regulation, AI regulation, what is and is not permissible, etc., it would be good to have a global standard and then smallish modifications in individual countries.
Okay, what is your take on India's hesitancy in devising an comprehensive AI law or passing a legislation?
I think in our case, it's largely inefficiency, bureaucracy, the slow pace. I mean, look how long it took us to come up with a data protection law. From the first initiative to when it finally reached the floor of Parliament was several years, and no other country took as long as we did. So my own view is that we ought to light a rocket under ourselves sometimes and move a little faster. But in this particular instance, because many countries are as far behind as we are, maybe we should all make common cause and work on this together.
Thank you. Right. So I see that we have one question from here.
So I'm Debaruti Guho. I'm working with Deutsche Welle right now. World is anything but multilateral, you said, and it's probably true, very much true when it comes to Ukraine crisis. It started with war, then it became a crisis, also issues with food security, etc. Do you still have hope? Do you think that there are groups or organizations which could bring a solution through the palette of multilateralism?
Well, I'm afraid so far I've seen no sign of it, in the sense that the one accomplishment that one can credit the UN for on the Ukraine war was the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where the UN played a very important role in working out a humanitarian agreement. That agreement has now collapsed. And you're once again seeing severe impediments on wheat exports. Don't forget, before the Ukraine war, Russia and Ukraine together accounted for 40% of global wheat exports. So suddenly there's going to be an impact on wheat prices, and other commodity prices will also be affected. Oil and gas has stabilized to some degree, partially because some countries have essentially either been exempted from or have exempted themselves from the sanctions of Russia, and their purchasing Russian oil has prevented global oil prices from shooting through the roof, because at least some of the demand that would otherwise have been concentrated on more limited supplies is being absorbed by Russian sales, and therefore you're able to see a relatively stable global price at the moment for oil and gas. So you're seeing all of these things happening. I would have liked to have seen the UN make more of an initiative. At the moment, clearly, the initiative has been confined to the humanitarian, and even that has failed. I'm not sure where it's going to go from there. Perhaps countries that have good relations with both sides, and China and India, both countries in that situation, with good relations with the Russians and good relations, more or less good relations with the Ukrainians, maybe they could try a peacemaking initiative. And that could be blessed by the rest of the world of those who want to see peace. My worry is two things. Number one is that both countries seem to still believe they can win, whatever win means in this context. So neither seems desperately keen on a peace initiative. And so far, whatever attempts have been made at peace initiatives have involved demands by each side that the other side cannot possibly concede. And then the second issue that that worries me about all of this is that people can develop a vested interest in warfare, in the continuation of war, as long as it doesn't hurt them. And I don't want to point fingers at any particular country or any set of interests, but it doesn't take very long to guess what I mean. There are a lot of people who have already come to an accommodation with the reality of this war, of sanctions, of certain new practices in terms of supplies, purchases, trade, etc. And this is fine with them. They can live with it, they can continue with it, and they seem to be willing to continue doing it. So I don't want a situation to be where people actually become complacent, saying, oh, this is what we have suffered, now we can live with this, and let's go on supporting the war effort on one side or the other indefinitely. Because I think on the whole, that's bad for war. And the problem with a long simmering war is that either the simmering part can die down, it's like a flame at the back of a burner, right? Or it can suddenly erupt and get much worse and drag in more countries. And because either is possible, you don't want the worst half to happen, you really should make a serious effort to bring about peace. I would certainly say that that China and India are the two countries that really ought to take an initiative and try and intervene. If they have not done so far, it's probably because they judge that the time isn't ripe yet. But waiting for ripeness is also a very special art. And often it's only with hindsight that you know that you tried too soon or too late or the right time. Sometimes you have to take a risk and step forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. With this, we come to the end of today's session, exactly at dot. And thank you so much, everybody, for your interesting questions. Thank you for our online audience for the amazing engagement online. We really appreciate you coming here, and we really appreciate our online attendees attending this event. And I would like to thank Dr. Tharoor. Many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your time, for sharing your experience and your valuable contribution. I've surely and certainly learned to be an effective communicator after today's session, and I'm taking some notes what to do when I go back home. And with this, we sign off. I encourage our attendees here to stay connected with us in our social media channels. Pretty sure you will see a card in front of your tables. You can just scan and be connected with us. You'll get some materials or resources from today's event and from our other future events. We do a brown bag lunch bi-monthly and a webinar monthly. So there's always something happening, and we would appreciate if you guys would attend our future sessions, and we'll see you next month. Stay tuned, and thank you, everyone. Attendees, we can head outside for our brown bag lunches.